to introduce our next speaker, who is Eytan Mann, a returning Azrieli Fellow in the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning at the Technion. And Eytan's presentation is entitled Neverending Story, Holding on to Oral Histories of Disappearing Sites. Eytan, the floor is yours.
Yes, morning. Let me share my screen. Show all window. Sorry, found it. Good morning. Do you see my screen? Yeah. Imagine that you are a young family in Haifa looking for a place to live, and you see this advertisement here. Start fresh in a new house, in a new neighborhood, with no neighbors or parking problems. Sounds good, right? Well, this is taken from a real ad. Maybe some of you who live in Haifa know that this neighborhood is not new at all. This is Wadi Salib, right at the center of Haifa. When you walk between the houses in Wadi Salib, you see a ruined place, frozen in time. And you ask yourself, what is this place? What is Wadi Salib? If I asked a Jewish immigrant from Morocco, a first or second generation, she would say Wadi Salib is where her parents settled in the early 50s in an empty and crumbling houses. And life was challenging but beautiful. She would also mention the Wadi Salib riots of 1959, a volcano that erupted and changed everything. Then if I asked a Palestinian, he would say life there under the imperial regime was good and comfortable, and that everything collapsed in 1948 during the Arab-Israeli war. Then if I would ask the mayor of Haifa during the 60s, he would say Wadi Salib is a slum and that it needs to be modernized, to be demolished and rebuilt, like in New York or in Berlin, to quote the original report. So which is the correct answer to what is Wadi Salib? And of course, there's no one answer, and all of these narratives are valid. So this brings me to my research question. When the physical remains of Wadi Salib is in danger today, how do we hold on to the multiple stories embedded within the site? In Wadi Salib, this challenge is to preserve the two aspects, the site and stories. As an architect and a computational designer myself, the game changer here is technology. In my research at the Material Topology Research Lab at the Technion, I'm developing techniques to capture both and link them. So on the one hand, I use laser scanning and drone photography to reconstruct the physical site. On the other hand, I make use of computational methods to process and analyze oral and written stories. Now, I zoom on the sites part. To preserve the site, I use 3D reconstruction to digitally clone the shape and appearance of the site. I also use computation to reconstruct spatial aspects from historical materials, such as photos. During my time at MIT Architecture, in the Digital Heritage Lab, we were commissioned to scan the whole site of Machu Picchu in Peru for the purpose of maintaining the site. So using here drone photogrammetry, we were able to produce accurate models of the structures and really the whole valley of Machu Picchu. And in Israel, I continue to record sites in 3D. So here we see the village of Lifta in the entrance to Jerusalem. And what you see is the outcome of a laser scan capture of the village's ancient irrigation system. And in Israel, I'm continuing to work in various sites, many of them in Jerusalem, producing these models. My research now focuses on Wadi Salib, where I am attempting to 3D reconstruct the site as it is today So again, using drone photogrammetry to produce 3D models of the ruined houses that are these days starting to be cleared and replaced with high-rise housing projects. And attempting to model also a certain past space, so-called, I employ automated techniques transforming 2D photos to 3D space using machine learning models. So a computer can recreate space to some extent using color analysis or camera movement in the case of historical films. So now I zoom on the sites part, on the stories part. Here, I interview relevant people to Wadi Salib, telling their stories. I then use natural language processing, a way of teaching a computer to understand the content of documents, including the contextual nuances of the language within them. The technology can then accurately extract information and insights contained in the documents, as well as categorize and organize these documents themselves. So, for example, in a tour with Ofer in Wadi Salib, he tells a story related to the 1959 riots. He says, when the shooting happened, I was standing right there at this spot. I heard the shot. By the way, this is just around the corner from where Haifa's mayor's son, Ibrahim El-Khalil, was murdered 20 years before that. Then later, the Israeli Prime Minister Meir came to visit the neighborhood of Wadi Salib before she gave the order to level the houses down. So using NLP, I can automatically extract location, dates, names, and keywords, and also perhaps a certain sentiment from the paragraphs. Here, a sentiment of violence and fear. This allows me new access to stories and finding points of connections between stories and also between different people. So my methodology attempts to link the site and stories and organize them together in a database. I then draw new connections between the site and stories according to different parameters. I identify points of connection within the data, and new composite stories are rendered to virtual reality headset or an on-site augmented reality device that allows a new understanding of the site's history. This reaffirming philosopher Chris Whitmore's observation that historical layers aren't simply written, erased, and rewritten. Instead, there are plenty of points of connection, proximity, and action between these various paths. And we lack a framework to capture these multiple layers together and allow them to coexist. So you will see a segment of a project I recently did in Lifta using a similar methodology. The user here puts a VR headset and steps into a 3D scan of the historical structures in Lifta. And stories about the very place are rendered into the viewport and can be interacted with using the gaze of the user. Seeing and hearing the site and stories together in one continuous space allows the spectator to experience the stories in context and learn to develop perhaps a certain empathy towards the narratives. In this case, stories and also drawings about Lifta's stone industry's history is integrated into VR. And the rendered stories change according to the decision of the viewer. So the motivation for this methodology is not only to create a tool for historians, but really to produce a collective memory for Wadi Salib, a certain spatial experience that is made from multiple stories from diverse identities. So next time you are promised a new neighborhood, you can experience at first hand what lies below the promise of the new place. Thank you. Of course, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I have a small question.
Yes.
So I know Wadi Salib because it happens that I'm going there. from time to time. And I just wonder, is there are any reservation, like Shimul, preservation efforts for it, or they're just going to decide that the whole neighborhood is going to be like new buildings, like you see, because
yes, this is a good question with a complicated answer.
Okay.
So the preservation for Wadi Salib is an issue that's on the table of planners in Haifa since the 80s. And there were plans there to make out of it a certain, what they call the artist village, a model similar to what you see in the historical center of Jaffa, for example.
Yeah.
But for various reasons, mostly market reasons, this never took off. And Wadi Salib is already 30, 40 years just there in the state of ruins. But now, recently, in the last years, you do see occasionally certain housing projects, like the image I started with, which try to integrate a certain preservation to the houses. And you see the foundational layer of the house sometimes preserved, and then there's 6 or 7 floors built on it. But in my opinion, the preservation is not such, so it really preserves the rich history of the place.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Hi.
Me, Daphne?
Please, yeah.
Eytan, it was a fascinating lecture presentation. Thank you. In according to the previous question, maybe I can ask if you can say, maybe do you have any connection to planning or to architecture projects with your tools?
Yeah, so we at the lab established a connection with the Haifa municipality and the preservation sector within the municipality. So we have a certain collaboration going on, and there is a kind of a project developing and producing this kind of platform that would be a database for preservation, and that will perhaps guide architects, preservation architects, in their work. I think definitely the 3D scanning part of it is interesting for our preservation architects, because they deal with trying to reconstruct those structures, which are many times very intricate in the kind of ornamentation and the architectural elements. And implementing these, a quick scan of these buildings is interesting, I think, from conversations I had with the preservationists, for implementing it into the documentation file, the tik tiud, as they call it in the preservation. Yeah, so I think bringing in this public partner like Haifa municipality potentially could be very interesting.
Eytan, I'm wondering if I can ask about the technology that you've been using a bit more. Specifically, you've mentioned NLP and doing sentiment analysis, and at least from what I know, especially because I'm assuming you're using Hebrew texts, NLP is not that developed, and sentiment analysis, even in English, is quite skewed. So I was wondering how you overcome it, or what are you doing to address that? And thank you. It's really fascinating research.
Yeah, thanks, Shani. This is a good question. Indeed, NLP is limited mostly to English, since the data that these models are trained on is English, and the question of language here is a question that demands that I just basically translate everything to English. So I'm trying to, the question of translation then becomes important. But to explore these models, there are no, right, like you mentioned, there's no other way than using translation. So I'm attempting as much as I can to use the service of expert translators, because I think this is, the translation is obviously an important factor here if we're dealing with this kind of layers of culture. And there are a number of, actually Haifa in the early 20th century is a center for many languages, even more Arab, Hebrew, and Armenian, all kinds of languages. So my only kind of option now is just to use translation, basically.
Eytan.
One sec, just Alon, one sec before you speak. Eytan, I just want to flag that you've got 3 people, you had 5 people wanting to ask you questions. You now have only 3. So perhaps collect the questions, the remaining questions, and then answer them so that everyone can have a chance to ask you. Okay.
Yes, Alon.
So first of all, it's a really beautiful project. Really, it's so inspiring. And so I have 2 questions. First, you mentioned that the Wadi Salib is currently in ruin, and I wondered, are there counter stories of current residents who view some merit in the current situation, or view their lives differently, have a different perspective, and can you capture those kind of perspectives also? So sometimes there are conflicting stories inside the community, and how to bring that also into view. So it's actually 3. So another small related question is, how do you to take into account the span of time in the in changes in the spatial settings? So from the 30s to the 70s, there were some changes in the housing, in how they looked, and how do you preserve all this kind of complexity? And lastly, it's a really different question regarding technology. And so it's a really beautiful project, but I'm wondering whether it enables us to preserve and to capture the richness of Wadi Salib, or do it also, in a maybe unintentionally, enables to bracket it and to put it aside and saying, okay, so we have that history, we put it aside, now we can focus on development that erases also the past. So we already preserved what's important, we captured it, we put it aside on a kind of Wikipedia, and now we can have a new modernity that actually really deeply denies that history. So I'm wondering how can we prevent those kind of misuses to those kind of projects? And it also relates also to the question of VR versus AR, of course. So yeah, so really, really beautiful.
Thanks. I'll just collect also Ambrin's question.
So yeah, thank you so much. It was fascinating and a beautiful presentation. And my question is very much related to Alon's last question. You know, what are the conflicting interests? There are so many applications for what you're doing, but also as researchers, you know, we often, sometimes not always, but we often reflect on our positionality in this and the potential ethical or philosophical implications of what we're doing. So, you know, whose narratives are heard? How are they used? How are they, you know, in archaeology, we talk about also here in Jerusalem, where I live a lot, you know, which layers are we actually going to analyze here? Whose narratives are we going to hear? And so how are you as a researcher kind of considering the conflicting aspects and voices behind how this can be used in the future, while knowing that this is a tool you're creating and releasing that can then be used in many different ways. So thank you so much.
Yes, thanks, Alon and Ambrin. I'll try to answer quite briefly, but I would happy to continue the conversation in a later time. Alona, the question relating to the counter narratives, I think there's something really interesting in Wadi Salib that emerges, since there are two communities. If you see the kind of the historians and the communities around the history of Wadi Salib, there's the Palestinian Arab community and there's the Mizrahi community, and they're in a way opposed in this kind of story, but they actually overlap in a very interesting way. So you see this kind of new interesting difference and the difference and actually similarities between those communities, and overlaying these are interesting because suddenly you see a certain common story of both. And the question of preservation here using these virtual technologies is also very interesting. It's a question. Google Culture has this big project of preserving monuments around the world in 3D using a similar method. And there are numerous legal claims, this would interest you, claiming that in a way this is kind of a new kind of looting, because you capture these, but actually you offer them the sometimes shrines or places of sacred that are sacred to certain communities. You open them up and kind of offer them to wide public, which is has pros and cons, but it's an interesting discussion. The question of really the claim of having over this place. And also working sometimes in Jerusalem, I encountered the situation where I scan the place and then I get questions and kind of people want to stop me from doing that. That it's weird. It's not exactly photography. It's kind of like they see it as more intrusive. I think it raises interesting questions. Abrin, regarding the subject, my subject position is also, I think, something I would love to continue talking about. In a way, I think using the computational tools here and using a database is also kind of trying to separate myself, my own subject position here, and take advantage of this data-driven process to allow the computer, in a way, a certain agency here. And so I don't believe I can really kind of not insert myself into this. Obviously, my own subject position is always there, but in a way, I think part of the question here from a critical point of view is really how this data-driven computational method kind of takes on its own agency and allows a certain new objectivity. I don't believe it's objectivity, but kind of a new intersecting between points of view and data segments. So, but I do believe kind of allowing this to be open source and trying to kind of develop interface that will be accessible to wide publics is important here, and hopefully has a certain future as a kind of way to at least offer some solidarity within this place in Wadi Salib, which is a very kind of, in a way, a conflicted place still.
Okay, thank you, Eytan. We don't have time for more questions, but thank you. Okay.